Put your chin down a little bit. Not that much. Okay.
So now we're going to talk about making a head and shoulders portrait with using a pretty popular light modifier, which is the Softbox. You'll find it in virtually every commercial studio. And as opposed to what we were doing earlier with the parabolic reflector where we see the hard edge shadows, we'll see a soft edge shadow transfer with this Softbox. Now most people start out with, this is about a medium-sized Softbox. It's about 24 by 30 inches. And most people start out with the vertical orientation of the Softbox. And you can start out that way, but here's what I'm going to recommend. We're going to raise that light just like we did the last time, talking about we want to have a 35 to 45 degree angle to keep those catch lights up at 10 o'clock or 2 o'clock. We need to know that in a Softbox, even though this has a double baffle in it, there's still a hot spot in the center of it, and so when I'm looking at my angle, I'm looking at the center of the Softbox here. Okay, so I've got my angle pretty good, and I'm always looking, have you look right up here, there we go, I'm always looking for the catch lights to see where that highlight is to verify that I've got the proper height and angle of my Softbox. Okay, give me a little bit of a smile, just a little, yeah, warm it up a little bit, turn your head, turn, turn. Yeah, right there, back, slight, right there, good. Perfect, thank you. When working in the studio, make sure you have a step stool handy, because one of the things we need to do is make sure we have a high enough angle, and our subject varies in height, and we need to vary our camera height, because as you recall, I want to be able to shoot at a downward angle to hide the Adam's apple of the neck, create a nice jawline, and also get more depth of field, more of an angled plane of focus that'll get the nose back to the ears in focus while keeping a rather shallow depth of field aperture. I generally like to work in the studio at f5.6, f8, maybe even f4 for a single individual. If it's a busy background, I want to throw it out of focus. So keep a studio light or a studio step stool handy. The other reason for having this higher camera angle has to do with the hair light above the model. Because if I am at an angle that the light is reflecting off of the hair directly into the lens, I will get specular highlights in the hair no matter what. And we're going to be talking a little bit more about power settings and exposure values for our hair light. But big thing to keep in mind is if I am up at a slightly elevated angle, that hair light is not going to reflect directly into the lens, and I'm going to avoid having lens flare issues from my hair light. Now, the other thing I want to talk about today is we have a posing aid. This is a, I'm going to turn this around for a minute. This is a cutout posing table that allows it to get in real close, and again, this is a head and shoulders portrait. We can get the body real close and use it as an aid to give us those diagonal lines to the shoulder that we talked about last time. The next thing I want to make sure we do is talk about the orientation of the Softbox. While most people will leave this in a vertical mode, my concern is I'm going to be illuminating the hand and the head just about equally. My personal recommendation is to turn this horizontally so that there's a little bit of fall off. If I'm going to show the hands, I would prefer to have the hands slightly darker. The goal in every portrait is to have the mask of the face be the brightest area within the image, because that is what will our eyes will automatically track towards, is the brightest spots in an image. So by turning it horizontally, I can cause the hand to have a slight fall off. I can keep the face fully illuminated, and the magic of a Softbox is the fact that all this light is reflecting everywhere in here. And so it's bouncing all over the place, and that's what's creating, it's almost like being on a cloudy day outdoors. I can bring this Softbox and avoid contaminating my background and feather it out away from the backdrop and still have all this light reflecting off the inside of the softbox towards the subject. So there are two things about working with a softbox as my main light. First of all, it's a large, soft, diffused light source. It's very much like having a high overcast day or a soft window light portrait, which is why the softbox is so commonly used in the studio, is to give that softer quality of light that makes everybody look so good. Now, what I want to point out though is if I position my softbox in the usual position at about a 45-degree angle from the subject, because remember we want side lighting to create highlight and shadow, but if I position my light in the usual situation, I'm going to have an exposure that is also exposing my background. Now again, we're using a white background today for ease of making a one-light portrait with good separation between the subject and the background. But what I want to point out is in the horizontal position, I can actually effectively swing this light source and feather it away from the background and make another exposure to where the background falls off dramatically. So when working with a softbox in the studio, we typically will start out with it in the usual position at about a 45-degree angle, which creates that classic loop lighting that we talked about last time. However, you'll notice because it's a large light source and it's got interior reflectors all the way through that's creating all this light bouncing around, I'm going to get a lot of light contamination on the background. And in fact, when I make a first exposure, go ahead, you'll see the background is fairly bright. But with the softbox in the horizontal position, I can actually come around and feather that away from my background and make another exposure, and you'll notice the background goes almost black. Okay? And that's one of the things I love about working with softboxes as the main light, is that I can control the light contamination on the background, and then if I turn on my background light and make another exposure, I can now have my background illuminated to the tone and brightness range that I want it to be. Okay, so the next topic of conversation regarding a studio portrait session is that of the background light. As we've already demonstrated, with no light, I can actually make this white background appear almost black. So we are going to light the background separately, and there are two basic light patterns that we will use in the studio. The first one is what I have here, which is to use a short background stand that is easily hidden from view by the subject, so it's hidden behind. Also, you'll notice by having the background stand behind the subject, we get a circular pattern to the light. We call this a radial background effect. Now I'll have my model come in here, Jordan. So when setting up our background light, we want to have it behind the model's back, and I like to angle the background light. The brightest area of the light would be, if I were to do it, it'd be about the solar plexus here, because what we want to have happen is we want the glow to radiate up and around circular and encompassing the shoulders, but we don't want the brightest area to be behind the head. We want the background to be darker behind the head because we want the face to stand out. So we're going to illuminate so we just get a nice radial light pattern behind the shoulders. Another nice feature to have with your background stand is a gel filter holder. This actually attaches to the light stand before the head does, and it allows me to use alligator clips to put a gel on the background light. With that, I can change the color temperature of the light, I can add multiple gels, and I can also change the power setting to control and add a color tone to my backdrop. Now I want to just tell you right now that if I add a color to white, if you remember color and design, when you mix white with any color, you're creating a tint, versus generally if I want saturated colors, I will only use color gels on a black or dark background, where I can produce a shade of color and have a lot more control over it. The other advantage of using a separate gel holder for my background light is that it creates a significant gap for the heat of the modeling light to dissipate. If I were to attach the gel directly to the reflector and leave the modeling light, it will melt onto the reflector, ruining both the gel and the modeling light. So make sure we keep enough gap in front of our light source for that reflector not to burn up from the heat. Otherwise, the other option you have is to go ahead and use a larger reflector, tape the gel in front of it, but turn off the modeling light. Now, even with turning off the modeling light, if you are firing the strobe a lot of times, it's still building a lot of energy coming out, and it will heat up significantly. So it's generally a good idea to use a gel holder in front of the lens. The next lighting pattern that I will typically use for a background light is a basic monolight with a small 7-inch reflector, and in this case about a 30-degree honeycomb grid in it. What that's going to allow me to do is create a beam of light that I can stream across the background. Now keep in mind, the goal of adding some tonal variety to our backdrop is to create the illusion of three-dimensional depth. When I have a seamless backdrop, just a single sweep of a single color, I'm creating this infinite space, so to speak. By adding a little variety, even slight variety of tonal value, brightness in that background, I can create the illusion of greater depth and distance to my background. So that's the primary purpose of a background light, is to add the illusion of depth to the portrait. So what I will typically do then is operate this light off to the side, and this is very critical. What I will do is set it off to the side opposite the main light. And the reason I will do that is because the shadow side of the face of my model is where I need the greatest contrast. So by having the main or the background light on the opposite side, I'm not creating a tone merger by having a highlight on the background on the same side as the highlight of the face. I'm going to put a highlight on the background. Let's flip off the ambient light. There we go. Go ahead and have a seat right here. Turn your head towards the light a little bit. The other way, towards the light. There we go. As you can see, by having the background sweeping from opposite the main light, the highlight side of the face is against the darker part of the background, and I can angle the light source and skim it across the surface just to create an illusion of depth by having it opposite the main light, having it up high, angling down so that the shadow side of the face gets the brightest part of the background, the highlight side of the face gets the darkest part of the background, and I create a juxtaposition of contrast. We want to create the illusion of depth through contrast. Now I want to take just a moment to talk a little bit about shutter speed on your camera. We want to use the fastest shutter speed that will fully synchronize with our electronic flash within our camera. Assuming we're working with digital and modern electronic shutters, we typically can work upwards to 200th of a second. So with that in mind, one of the nice things in the studio is we can have a bright ambient light around, and that's not going to affect our exposure at all, because if I were to expose for the room interior lights, I'd be down at a shutter speed at like 1/8 of a second, 1/6 of a second. So the ambient light and the modeling lights of our lights are having zero effect on our actual exposure. So what's nice about that is I can have a fairly bright studio that has the subject's pupils fully constricted to reveal the full color in the eye. Now when working with a softbox, one of the most common mistakes with a softbox is keeping the light far from the subject. And again, because we're working at head and shoulders, we can really bring this light source a lot closer. The softness of the light is based upon the relative size between the subject and the light source. The larger the light source, the softer the light. Let me say that again. If the light source is large compared to the subject, it will be a soft edge transfer. If I'm working with, and I come into studios all the time and I see people working with a medium-sized softbox like this, but they have it pulled way back from the subject, and you'll notice you'll get harder edges to your shadows. The smaller the light source, the harder the edge light source. You notice last time when we were working with reflectors, the small 7-inch reflector created a really hard, crisp shadow line, and the larger reflector made it slightly softer. Well, the goal with the softbox, obviously, is implied in the name, soft. We want to bring that light source as close as we can without getting it into our composition in order to create this wraparound light that's just going to feather. And so we can create short, broad, and split lighting, but have a very soft quality to it and create an image that's very, very sellable rather easily. Okay? So softbox is a very popular format for commercial photographs, and it makes it very easy to make sellable results if we know how to control the softness of this light by bringing it closer to the subject, as close as we can without seeing it in our frame. So you'll notice the further Jordan has the softbox away from the subject, the harder the shadow lines are with our exposure. Okay? Now, bring it in closer, and keep in mind, because of the inverse square law, and feather it back towards me a little bit more, turn it towards me. With the inverse square law, by bringing that light just a little bit forward, I've added a lot of exposure to it. Let's bring it in even closer. I'm going to create a nice soft edge. Real close. Bring it in real close. There we go. Oh, and that's good. Okay. And notice how much softer the light is on the face as we come in closer, and we're going to bring the power down just a little bit to compensate for the increased exposure. The closer the light source to the subject, the more intense it is. Therefore, we have to control our brightness of our light. One of the easiest ways to make a really sellable portrait is to work with a softbox as a main light and a simple reflector as a fill. Now I have a two-sided reflector, one side silver, which is going to be the most efficient reflective surface, which will create almost a 1-to-1 ratio if I have it really close to the subject. Or I can have a softer reflectance with a white. Now you can get warm tones, and we'll talk more about using that more in outdoor portraiture, but in the studio I generally will use, I prefer the white side to the silver, because what will typically happen is you'll almost get a little, it feels like reflected light off of a pool onto the face. It'll create some little shiny. It can be an interesting effect, but for commercial work, I generally want to minimize that, and I'll go with the white. Now I'm going to take a series of exposures here, and I'm going to start out with the reflector really close to the subject, and then I'm going to back it up, and I'll back it up a little bit further. And you will see a variety of tonal ranges in your shadows based upon the distance of the reflector. Now I have one other little business tidbit, which is when you are photographing a portrait session and somebody has brought their parent along, their mother, their father, or their best friend, I will tell you that it's very hard to get a successful portrait with a model when somebody that's close to them is observing that portrait session. There will generally be banter, there'll be teasing, people are just kind of naturally a little stage fright in front of their friends being their photographed. So one of the best things that I can do is take a large reflector and have the friend, the parent, hold it, and I have them hold it in such a way that they can't directly see the subject being photographed. Now this is a little behind the scenes trickery, so to speak, of how to manage people in the studio. But one of the best things I can do, even if I don't need a reflector, but I've got a third wheel along for the photo shoot, I will hand them a reflector and have them adjust it to where they cannot directly observe what the subject is doing, and it creates that privacy necessary to be able to get the interaction I need as a portrait photographer for a moment. And if you don't have an assistant, you can get a controller arm that will hold that reflector for you. So in this case, if I'm working by myself, I can bring in a reflector and hold it in position. Now, when working with reflectors, we need to think about the angle of reflection equals the angle of incidence. So we want to have the reflector at roughly the same parallel angle to our main softbox light. And we can control how dark our shadows are by how close that reflector is. So now, the next subject that I really want to talk about today is how to work with hands in a portrait. So one of the reasons we're using this posing table today is so that we can have something that the subject can lean their elbows on and bring the hands into the portrait. Hands and the eyes are probably two of the most descriptive characteristics of a human being, because we can say a lot or tell a lot about another human being based upon the condition of their hands. Do they work manual labor, hard labor? Do they have manicured hands and soft skin? Do they have the wrinkles and the lines of great experience that we tend to associate with wisdom? So it's quite often that I like to work with hands in a portrait. There are a couple of unique ways to deal with hands. First of all, I want to talk about avoiding an overly aggressive stance with the hands. So a lot of times people will naturally clench their fist, particularly when making a portrait, right? And that looks really aggressive. The easiest way to deal with softening the fist is to have the subject matter, we call this the GQ look, have the subject take their thumb and index finger, bring them together, okay, like this, and then close the rest of their hand. Now I can have something that is thoughtful and yet masculine and soft, okay, at the same time. So I can work with that. The other thing that I'll do, so if I'll have you go ahead and raise your hand up, bring your elbow down, thank you very much. Take that index finger, boom, close the rest, and now bring the hand to the chin. We have the classic thinking man pose of that great statue. But the other thing we need to watch is we don't want the hand to smush into the chin. So remember from last time when I talked about posing, is we want to take what somebody does. They find their natural equilibrium of balancing their head on their hand, and they might do it like this, they might do it like this. Whatever it is they do, I as a photographer have to be aware of what I need to do to slightly augment that by either having them, for that brief moment of that flash exposure, lift their chin up so that I get a clean jawline. I don't want that chin to smush up there. So I can have you just lift your chin up and extend it forward. There we go, good. And then I'm going to come and look at it from a camera view. The next thing I want to talk about, and he's got a great situation here in that he's got a very interesting, visually interesting ring, he's got a very interesting watch, and he's got a necklace on. So that would be a reason to bring a hand into this composition. We're not going to see the table, that's not what we're featuring. We're going to focus on the head and shoulders here. But what we have to watch out for is any flat of the hand has about the same area of skin similar to the mask of the face. And because it's bright skin tone, as bright as the mask of the face, it's going to draw attention away from the face. So what we typically want to do with our hand is turn it slightly to create more of a slim profile so that the size of the mask is larger than the size of the face. And then I'm going to have you just bring your other hand up onto your, there we go, to bring those shoulders out, extend your, arch your back just a little bit, there we go, good, turn your head slightly this way, great, and looking right up here, and we'll get the exposure, excellent. Now, I can do a lot of things with hands, I can bring both elbows, and this is a posing table that has an adjustable height. Go ahead and relax, relax your arm, just go ahead and pull your arm back, yeah. We're going to raise this up. Now, with hands and with the arms in general, one of the classic poses to be working with is symmetry by bringing hands together, whether it be the praying pose or the news desk anchor pose. We can bring our elbows both onto the table. There we go. And you'll notice how relaxing that is for the subject matter. So using a posing table, even if we're not seeing the hands, allows us to allow the subject to create a posture that's very comfortable and symmetrical in this case, so that we can again get our three styles of light. Remember, we have the light on one side, and if the subject turns this way, keep turning, there we go, right there, looking right up here, good, 2/3 view of the face, click. We've got our short lighting, come back this way, keep coming. I'll bring this light out a little bit further here. Okay, straight on, right there is very symmetrical. There's our split lighting. Now turn slightly a little more, watching for that ear nubbin that we talked about right there, and looking off right there, good. And now, one of the things we want to talk about with head and shoulders, when we're doing short, broad, and split lighting, we have to really pay attention to the gaze of the eye. The gaze of the eye needs to either be at the camera, and I always tell the subject to look through the camera, look beyond it, that penetrating gaze. Or they need to be looking off far enough in the distance in which I will give them a finger to target. I always joke that I'm the one giving them the finger, right? And if you're working with children, you might put a little smiley face on your finger and make a little finger puppet to attract their attention. But you want to make sure that the gaze is off axis from the camera far enough to look intentional. The worst thing you can do is have the subject, it's kind of like when I'm photographing at a wedding event and there's somebody with a camera right next to me, and one person's looking at my camera and one person's looking at the person next to me, they look cross-eyed. It looks wrong. So we generally try to suppress cameras operating beside me, and we generally try to suppress the eye looking just off camera. We either want to make it way off camera at a nice 45-degree angle, or we want to have a penetrating gaze through the camera. As I just mentioned about the gaze of the model, they're either looking through the camera, sometimes you might have them look slightly up from the camera. What do we do if people squint? One of the easiest things to do is bring your chin down just a little bit, and then bring your eyes up and give a target a little bit higher. It forces those eyes open a little bit further, and take an exposure. Okay. The other thing we want to pay attention to is when the subject is looking afield, looking out at an angle, watch the whites of the eye. If the whites of the eye start to be the eyes get too far into the corner, it starts to look really strange. So again, remember the metaphor of the juggler with all the different elements. Everything is really simple in portraiture, but it's really complex to get it to all work together. So I have to instantly be aware of how far over. If I have you follow the eye, take an exposure right there, looking right there, good. See how much white of the eye there is, it looks abnormal. Now I'll bring it back and have a little more of a centered gaze, and then I'll have it right over there looking right at the camera, and you can see the symmetry that we want to create within the eyeballs themselves. Look, he's a moose. One more.
Your hands are in the right spot.
Was that good?
No, you need to put your hands more.
Oh, let's see.